Today we're going to work on translating sentences from English into Spanish. These sentences are a bit tricky and you'll see why in a minute. Try to say the Spanish sentence before you see it on screen. The first one is, it depends on the weather. How do you say that in Spanish? In Spanish, we don't have the neutral pronoun, so we can start with the verb. Depende. Depende. We do have to conjugate it, and it's usually the conjugation for the third person singular. The preposition changes, and this is where it gets tricky. We don't use on in Spanish, we use de. Depende del clima. Clima is the weather. Here, del is one of the few contractions we have in Spanish. It comes from de, of, and el, va. And it becomes one because the vowels are shared. Depende del clima. So this sentence is tricky because we don't have a pronoun in Spanish, and instead of using on, which would translate to en in Spanish, we use de, which technically means of or from. Depende del clima. Let's take a look at another one. Everything depends on you. How do you say everything? It's todo. Todo. Depends, depende, and on you, de ti. Todo depende de ti. Todo depende de ti. So again, here we see de instead of en. And these are just verb collocations that go with certain prepositions. The next sentence is, my happiness doesn't depend on other people. How would you say that in Spanish? Let's start with my happiness. It is mi felicidad. Mi felicidad. Then we see doesn't, but in Spanish we just use the word no. Depend, depende, on other people, de otras personas. Mi felicidad no depende de otras personas. So personas could mean persons. In Spanish, that's more common than using gente for this type of sentences. Gente means people. But here it's more common to use personas. Mi felicidad no depende de otras personas. And again, we see here that depend on gets translated to depende de. All right, let's take a look at another verb. I'm thinking about you. How would you say that in Spanish? I'm thinking is estoy pensando. Or we can use the pronoun, but it's not needed because the verb is conjugated to the person. With the pronoun, it is yo estoy pensando. Now, in English, we use about, but in Spanish, we use en. About usually gets translated to sobre. So we wouldn't say sobre ti, we say en ti. Estoy pensando en ti. Estoy pensando en ti. With this one, if you say sobre ti, it's still understood. People will understand. But the common preposition here is en. Estoy pensando en ti. How about, I think a lot about my family. How would you say that? I think is pienso. Pienso. A lot is mucho. Mucho. About my family, en mi familia. Pienso mucho en mi familia. Pienso mucho en mi familia. Muy bien. The next one is, what are you thinking about? How would you ask this question? This one's a little tricky because the order of the words change. In Spanish, we start with en, which is about, right? And then we use qué, what, en qué. Estás pensando. Estás, or you, pensando, thinking. So it ends up being like about what are you thinking. ¿En qué estás pensando? We wouldn't put en at the end. We wouldn't say ¿qué estás pensando en? That doesn't make sense. It goes at the beginning. ¿En qué estás pensando? All right, the next sentence is, last night I dreamed about you. How would you say that in Spanish? So last night is anoche. Anoche. I dreamed. Soñé. It's in past tense. And then here, about you, instead of about, we use con. But this specific wording turns into contigo. It's just one word. Anoche soñé contigo. Anoche soñé contigo. Contigo is a word that evolved from Latin. So it just ended up being like this. But con technically means with. So with this combination of soñé plus the preposition, we don't use about in Spanish, we use con. Let's take a look at more examples. I dream about traveling around the world. How would you say that in Spanish? I dream is sueño, sueño. And about, in this case, is con, con. And again, con technically means with, but this is the combination that we use with this verb. Sueño con. Traveling, viajar. We didn't use the gerund in this case. I know in English there are specific verbs that are used with gerunds, like this combination, I dream about, then we use a gerund. In Spanish, it's the infinitive verb. Sueño con viajar around the world por el mundo. Por el mundo. We could also say alrededor. That's the more literal translation of around. But we can use por. Sueño con viajar por el mundo. Sueño con viajar por el mundo. All right, the next sentence is she dreams about having her own business. How would you say this in Spanish? We start with she dreams. Ella sueña. Ella sueña. We could just start with the verb sueña. But that verb conjugation can work for he or for the formal singular you. So for this verb conjugation, it's best to use the pronoun. Ella sueña. Instead of about, we are going to use con. And here again, instead of the gerund, we use the infinitive in Spanish. Tener. Tener. Her own business. Su propio negocio. Ella sueña con tener su propio negocio. Ella sueña con tener su propio negocio. All right, let's look at another verb. I fell in love with him. How would you say that in Spanish? This one's tricky. To fall in love is the terminology that we use in English. In Spanish, it's just one verb, and it's reflexive. So, I fell in love is yo me enamoré. We can drop yo. We could just say me enamoré. Me enamoré. I fell in love. Instead of using with, which would be con, we use de, of or from. De él, with him. Me enamoré de él. If we wanted to say I fell in love with her, we just change the last pronoun. Me enamoré de ella. Me enamoré de ella. How would you say they fell in love with this city? They fell in love is se enamoraron. We have to conjugate the verb to the person. We could use the pronoun, in this case, they could be ellos or ellas. Se enamoraron with the city de la ciudad. De la ciudad. Se enamoraron de la ciudad. Se enamoraron de la ciudad. How would you say she is falling in love with her best friend? She is falling in love is ella se, the reflexive, está enamorando. Ella se está enamorando. With her best friend de su mejor amigo. de su mejor amigo. Ella se está enamorando de su mejor amigo. Ella se está enamorando de su mejor amigo. So again, in Spanish, to fall in love, it's a verb. It's enamorarse. It's reflexive, so we have to use the reflexive pronouns. But it gets conjugated like any other verb. All right, the last verb set that we're going to see today is complains about. For example, he always complains about everything. How would you say that in Spanish? So we can start with the pronoun. It is él, always, siempre, siempre. And complains in Spanish is also a reflexive verb. Se queja, complains, se queja. And here, instead of using about in Spanish, sobre, we're going to use de, of or from. De todo, everything. Él siempre se queja de todo. Él siempre se queja de todo. How would you say they are complaining about the service in Spanish? They could mean ellos or ellas. Then we have se están quejando. So the gerund. Ellos se están quejando. In Spanish, we use the gerund with the verb estar. That's why we see están in this sentence. Están is conjugated to ellos. About the service is del servicio. So we see that contraction again here. De él, del servicio. Ellos se están quejando del servicio. Ellos se están quejando del servicio. The last sentence is I complain about the noise. How would you say that in Spanish? I complain is yo me quejo. Or we could just say me quejo about the noise, del ruido. So again, the contraction from de él becomes just one, del. Me quejo del ruido. If we wanted to say this in the past tense, I complained about the noise. Me quejé del ruido. Me quejé del ruido. Great job today. So just as a recap, to depend on in Spanish is depender de. Depender de. To think about, pensar en. Pensar en. To dream about, soñar con. Soñar con. To fall in love with, enamorarse de. Enamorarse de. And to complain about, quejarse de. Quejarse de. I hope this was useful and clear, and to keep learning Spanish, go watch this video next. Muchas gracias.